An 82-year-old man's final words to his waitress weren't goodbye. They were an address. Have you ever received a message that completely changed your life? Because what Sarah Martinez found in that basement rewrote American history. This is her story, and it begins with a simple act of kindness that turned into the biggest government scandal in decades. Sarah had been serving coffee at Mel's Diner for 3 years, working double shifts just to keep her head above water. Her father was disabled, confined to a wheelchair after a construction accident, and their medical bills seemed to grow larger every month. She'd taken this job straight out of high school, putting her dreams of college on hold to take care of the man who had raised her alone after her mother died. The diner wasn't much to look at. Red vinyl booths with tears in the seats, a coffee machine that needed to be coaxed into working every morning, and fluorescent lights that flickered just enough to give everyone a headache. But it was honest work, and Sarah had learned to find dignity in serving others, even when some customers treated her like she was invisible. Harold Winston wasn't like the other customers. He'd been coming in every Tuesday morning for exactly 2 years, always ordering the same thing: black coffee, wheat toast with no butter, and a small orange juice. He always sat in booth 7, always left exactly a 15% tip, and always said please and thank you in a voice that was soft but clear. Sarah had tried to make conversation with him over the months. Where was he from? Did he have family? What did he do for work? But Harold would just smile politely and change the subject, asking her about school or her father's health instead. There was something about his eyes, though. They were sharp, intelligent, watching everything with an intensity that seemed unusual for a man his age. What Sarah didn't know was that Harold Winston had been evaluating her character for 2 full years. Every Tuesday morning was a test. How did she treat difficult customers? Did she take shortcuts when she thought no one was looking? Was she honest when the cash register gave her too much change? Harold had been watching, measuring, deciding whether this young woman possessed the integrity he desperately needed to find. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, something was different. Harold's hands were shaking as he lifted his coffee cup. His usual neat appearance seemed disheveled, and there was an urgency in his manner that Sarah had never seen before. When she approached his table to refill his coffee, he looked up at her with eyes that seemed to be pleading for something she didn't understand. The breakfast rush was winding down when it happened. Sarah was clearing plates from the counter when she heard a sharp gasp from booth 7. She turned to see Harold clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. Without thinking, she rushed to his side as other customers began to panic. While someone called 911, Sarah knelt beside Harold's chair, taking his trembling hand in hers. "Help is coming," she whispered, trying to keep her voice calm even though her heart was racing. "You're going to be okay, Mr. Winston. Just hold on." Harold's breathing was labored, but his grip on her hand was surprisingly strong. His eyes found hers, and in them she saw not just pain, but a desperate need to communicate something important. That's when he spoke the words that would change everything. His voice was barely audible, but Sarah heard every syllable clearly: "Check the basement of 1247 Oak Street." She stared at him in confusion. "What?" she whispered. But Harold's eyes were already losing focus, his breathing becoming more shallow. 1247 Oak Street, he repeated, his grip tightening on her wrist. "The basement. Promise me." Sarah nodded, not understanding but sensing the crucial importance of this moment. "I promise," she said, and Harold Winston closed his eyes for the last time. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was too late. Harold Winston was pronounced dead at Mercy General Hospital at 9:43 that morning. The cause listed as massive cardiac arrest. Sarah gave her statement to the police, describing what had happened, but she didn't mention the address. Something told her to keep those final words private, at least until she understood what they meant. The funeral was small, just a handful of people Sarah didn't recognize and a minister who clearly hadn't known Harold personally. Sarah attended, sitting in the back pew of the tiny chapel, wondering about this man who had trusted her with his dying words. According to the obituary, Harold Winston had been a widower with no children, a retired government worker who had lived quietly in a small apartment downtown. But 1247 Oak Street haunted Sarah's thoughts. She'd driven past the address twice, not brave enough to stop. The house was clearly abandoned, with boarded-up windows and a yard overgrown with weeds. It sat in one of the city's worst neighborhoods, where decent people didn't venture after dark. Why would Harold's last thoughts be about such a place? 3 days after the funeral, Sarah couldn't stand the mystery any longer. She told her father she was working a late shift, packed a flashlight and her father's crowbar in her old Honda, and drove to Oak Street as darkness fell. The house looked even more foreboding at night, a dark silhouette against the streetlights. Several windows on the block were boarded up, and she could see why this area had been abandoned by anyone who could afford to leave. Sarah parked across the street and sat in her car for 20 minutes, trying to build up the courage to approach the house. What was she doing? This was insane. She was a waitress, not some kind of detective or treasure hunter. But Harold's eyes in those final moments kept haunting her. There had been such urgency there, such desperate need. He had trusted her with something, and she owed it to his memory to find out what. The front door was secured with a heavy padlock, but Sarah found that the back door was only held shut by a piece of plywood that she could pry loose with the crowbar. The smell that hit her when she opened the door was overwhelming, decades of mold, dust, and decay. She covered her nose with her shirt and stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The house was completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, just bare walls and floors covered in dust and debris. Sarah made her way carefully through the rooms, looking for anything that might explain Harold's final words. In what had once been the kitchen, she found the door to the basement. It was unlocked, and the wooden stairs creaked ominously under her weight as she descended. The basement was exactly what she expected: concrete walls, a few scattered cardboard boxes, and the musty smell of a space that hadn't seen light in years. Sarah was beginning to think this had been a mistake, that perhaps Harold's dying words had been nothing more than the confused ramblings of a man in cardiac arrest. But then her flashlight beam swept across the far wall, and she saw something that made her heart stop. Hidden behind a stack of moldering boxes was a steel door that looked completely out of place in this decrepit basement. It was new, or at least much newer than anything else in the house, and it was secured with a combination lock that gleamed under her flashlight beam. Someone had installed this door recently, and they had wanted to keep whatever was behind it very secure. Sarah stared at the lock, her mind racing. A combination. But what combination? She thought about everything she knew about Harold Winston, which wasn't much. Then she remembered seeing his driver's license when the paramedics had checked his wallet. His birthday, August 15, 1941. 081541. With trembling fingers, Sarah dialed in the numbers. The lock clicked open. Behind the steel door was a room that shouldn't have existed. It was clean, organized, and filled with equipment that looked like it belonged in an office building, not in the basement of an abandoned house. Metal filing cabinets lined 3 walls, and a desk sat in the center of the room with papers neatly stacked on its surface. Everything was covered with a thin layer of dust, but it was clear that someone had maintained this space carefully for years. Sarah's flashlight beam caught something on the desk that made her blood run cold. A folder marked "Classified" in red letters. She opened it with shaking hands and found photographs of men in suits, bank statements, and documents that mentioned names she recognized from the news. Supreme Court justices. Senators. Cabinet members. This wasn't just classified information, this was evidence of something massive. But who had compiled all this? And why had Harold Winston known about this place? Sarah found her answer in a personnel file tucked into one of the desk drawers. Agent Harold Winston, Federal Bureau of Investigation, hired 1964, retired 2004. Specialized in government corruption and counterintelligence. This wasn't the file of a simple government worker, this was the record of a man who had spent 40 years investigating the very people he was supposed to serve. Harold Winston hadn't been just a lonely old man who came to the diner for breakfast. He had been a federal agent, and this secret room was his private investigation headquarters. Sarah realized she was standing in the middle of the biggest secret in American political history, and she was completely out of her depth. Sarah spent the next hour going through Harold's files, her amazement growing with each document. This wasn't random information gathering, this was a carefully constructed case built over decades. Bank records showing mysterious payments to government officials. Photographs of secret meetings. Audio transcripts of conversations that should never have been recorded. Harold Winston had been building evidence of the biggest conspiracy in American political history. The scope of what she was seeing took her breath away. According to Harold's meticulously kept records, a network of foreign agents had been systematically infiltrating the American government for over 30 years. They had placed their people in key positions, bought off politicians and judges, and slowly gained control of the decision-making process at the highest levels of power. The files showed payments totaling millions of dollars flowing from shell companies based in hostile foreign countries to American officials. Supreme Court justices who had ruled in favor of foreign interests had received substantial, consulting fees from companies that didn't seem to do any actual consulting. Senators had voted on legislation after receiving money transferred through a complex network of offshore accounts designed to hide the true source of the funds. But what made this conspiracy so dangerous was how patient and subtle it had been. These weren't dramatic coups or obvious acts of treason. Instead, it was a slow, careful process of corruption that had been building for decades. A favorable ruling here, a blocked investigation there, a strategic vote when it really mattered. Over time, these small acts of betrayal had fundamentally altered the direction of American policy in ways that benefited foreign powers at the expense of American interests. Sarah found Harold's personal journal, written in his careful handwriting and stored in a fireproof safe that had been hidden behind one of the filing cabinets. The entries went back 20 years and told the story of a man who had stumbled onto something far bigger than he had ever imagined when he started investigating routine corruption cases as a young FBI agent. The early entries showed Harold's growing frustration with cases that were shut down from above, witnesses who disappeared, and evidence that mysteriously went missing. He had begun to suspect that the corruption went higher than anyone realized, and he had started keeping his own copies of everything, storing them in locations that his own agency couldn't access. As the years passed, Harold's investigation had grown more sophisticated and more dangerous. He had learned to work alone, trusting no one within the FBI hierarchy. He had developed a network of sources in different agencies, people who shared his suspicions but who were afraid to speak publicly. Together, they had built a case that would have brought down dozens of high-ranking officials and exposed a conspiracy that reached into every branch of government. But Harold had also documented the price of his investigation. Colleagues who had died in suspicious accidents. Witnesses who had committed suicide under questionable circumstances. His own career had been sidelined, with promising cases reassigned and his requests for resources repeatedly denied. He had been forced to retire early, officially for health reasons, but really because he had gotten too close to the truth. The most recent entries in Harold's journal revealed why he had been so urgent in his final moments. He had discovered that his investigation had been compromised. Someone high up in the FBI had learned about his secret files, and Harold knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him. His heart medication had been tampered with, he was certain of it. The cardiac episodes he had been experiencing weren't natural, they were the result of a slow-acting poison designed to kill him gradually and make his death appear to be from natural causes. Harold had known he was dying, and he had maybe days or weeks to find someone trustworthy enough to continue his work. That's why he had been coming to Mel's diner every Tuesday for 2 years, watching Sarah, evaluating her character, determining whether she had the integrity and courage to handle the most important secret in American history. The final entry in Harold's journal was dated just 1 week before his death. I have made my choice. The waitress at Mel's diner has shown herself to be honest, compassionate, and brave. She does not know it yet, but she may be America's last hope. If something happens to me, I pray she will have the strength to finish what I started. The evidence is all here. Someone must tell the truth, even if it costs them everything. Sarah sat in that secret room, surrounded by evidence of betrayal at the highest levels of government, and realized that her life had just changed forever. Harold Winston hadn't just died at her table, he had passed on a responsibility that was both an honor and a terrible burden. She was no longer just a waitress trying to pay her father's medical bills. She was now the keeper of secrets that could save American democracy or get her killed. Sarah spent the rest of the night in Harold's secret room, reading through files and trying to understand the full scope of what she had inherited. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Harold had been building this case for over 2 decades, and every document, every photograph, every financial record had been verified through multiple sources. The conspiracy involved 12 high-ranking government officials, including 3 Supreme Court justices, 4 senators, 2 cabinet secretaries, and 3 federal judges. The money trail led back to intelligence services of countries that were nominally America's enemies, but the payments had been routed through such a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts that it had taken Harold years to trace them to their sources. What made the evidence so compelling was its scope and detail. Harold hadn't just documented the payments, he had recorded the specific decisions these officials had made that benefited foreign interests. Court rulings that had weakened America's ability to prosecute foreign espionage. Legislative votes that had reduced funding for counterintelligence operations. Administrative decisions that had made it easier for foreign agents to operate on American soil. But as Sarah read through the files, she also began to understand the danger she was now in. Harold's journal documented several attempts on his life over the past 5 years. A car accident that had been blamed on mechanical failure but showed signs of tampering. A break-in at his apartment where nothing was stolen but his files had been searched. The gradual poisoning that had finally killed him just days ago. The people behind this conspiracy had killed before, and they would kill again. Harold's journal mentioned at least 6 other investigators who had died under suspicious circumstances over the past decade. Heart attacks, suicides, accidents, all carefully orchestrated to look natural while eliminating threats to the network. Sarah realized that by sitting in this room, by reading these files, she had made herself their next target. Harold's journal also revealed something else that chilled Sarah to the bone. The conspiracy didn't just involve taking money from foreign governments, it was actively working to weaken American institutions from within. The ultimate goal was to create so much division and dysfunction that the country would become ungovernable, making it easier for foreign powers to expand their influence while America was distracted by internal conflicts. Some of the recent political crises that had dominated the news were actually manufactured by this network. Controversial court decisions that had inflamed public opinion were the result of corrupted justices following orders. Legislative gridlock that had prevented important security measures from passing was orchestrated by senators who were being paid to create chaos. The growing polarization that was tearing the country apart wasn't entirely natural, it was being deliberately encouraged by people who benefited from American weakness. Sarah found a letter addressed to her in Harold's neat handwriting, dated just 2 days before his death. He had somehow known that she would be the one to find this room, that she would be brave enough to follow through on his dying words. The letter explained why he had chosen her and what he hoped she would do with the information. Dear Miss Martinez, the letter began, if you are reading this, then I am dead and you have had the courage to honor my final request. I have watched you for 2 years, not because I was lonely or bored, but because I was looking for someone with the integrity to carry on the most important work of my life. You have shown kindness to strangers, honesty in small matters, and courage when others needed help. These qualities are rare, and they are exactly what this situation requires. The letter went on to explain Harold's investigation in terms that were easier for Sarah to understand. It provided context for the evidence, explained how the various pieces fit together, and outlined the specific steps that would be needed to expose the conspiracy. Harold had already identified journalists he trusted, law enforcement officials who were still clean, and political figures who could be counted on to act on the evidence once it was presented. But the letter also included a stark warning about the dangers Sarah would face if she chose to move forward. These people have unlimited resources and no conscience, Harold wrote. They will try to discredit you, intimidate you, and if necessary, eliminate you. If you decide to take on this responsibility, you must be prepared for the possibility that it will cost you everything, including your life. But if you do nothing, this conspiracy will continue to grow stronger, and America as we know it will eventually cease to exist. Harold had also thought about Sarah's father and his medical needs. Hidden in the safe was an envelope containing $50,000 in cash, money Harold had saved over the years specifically to help whoever took over his investigation. This should cover your father's care while you decide what to do, the letter explained. But understand that once you make your choice, there will be no going back. Sarah sat in that underground room until dawn, weighing her options. She could take the money, destroy the evidence, and go back to her life as a waitress. Her father would be taken care of, and she would be safe. Or she could honor Harold's trust and try to expose the biggest conspiracy in American political history, knowing that it would probably cost her everything. Sarah chose justice. She spent the entire night in Harold's secret room, photographing documents, copying files, and preparing evidence packages. Harold had already identified a journalist he trusted, David Chen at the Washington Herald, a man who'd spent his career exposing government corruption and had the resources to properly investigate and publish such explosive information. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to the diner, left her father in the care of their neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez, and drove to Washington, D.C. with a suitcase full of evidence that could bring down the American government. The 3-hour drive gave her plenty of time to think about what she was doing, and by the time she parked outside the Herald building, she was terrified but determined. David Chen was nothing like Sarah had expected. Instead of the hard-nosed investigative reporter she'd imagined, he was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who looked more like a college professor than someone who'd made his career taking down corrupt politicians. But when Sarah began explaining why she was there, his demeanor changed completely. His eyes became sharp and focused, and she could see the mind of a seasoned investigative journalist processing every detail. "Harold Winston," David said when Sarah mentioned the name. "I've been waiting for this call for 5 years. Harold contacted me back in 2018, said he had something big but needed more time to build the case. Then he went quiet. When I saw his obituary last week, I figured the story had died with him." David leaned back in his chair and studied Sarah carefully. He chose well. This took real courage. Sarah spread the documents across David's desk, watching his expression change as he began to understand the scope of what she was showing him. Bank records proving payments from foreign shell companies to American officials. Photographs of secret meetings. Audio transcripts of conversations that should never have been recorded. It was the biggest political scandal in American history, meticulously documented over 2 decades. "This is unbelievable," David whispered as he examined the evidence. 3 Supreme Court justices taking money from foreign governments. 4 senators selling classified information. If this is true, it could bring down the entire government. He looked up at Sarah with a mixture of amazement and concern. "You realize what you're risking by coming forward with this? These people have killed to keep their secrets." "They already killed Harold," Sarah replied quietly. "He trusted me to finish what he started. I can't let his death be meaningless." She thought about Harold's final moments, the desperation in his eyes as he whispered that address to her. "He spent 40 years building this case. Someone has to tell the truth." David nodded, his expression grim but determined. "This story will take weeks to verify and write properly. We'll need to confirm every source, authenticate every document, contact every official for comment. And we'll need to keep you safe while we do it." He pulled out his phone and began making calls to security experts, legal advisors, and other journalists who could help with such a massive investigation. The next 3 weeks were a blur of safe houses, encrypted communications, and endless verification of Harold's evidence. David brought in a team of investigative reporters, forensic accountants, and legal experts to examine every aspect of the conspiracy. Sarah found herself living under protection, moved from location to location as the investigation progressed. But the story Harold had spent decades building held up under scrutiny. Every document was authentic. Every financial record checked out. Every photograph could be verified. The conspiracy wasn't just real, it was bigger and more dangerous than even Harold had imagined. The foreign agents had been patient, working for over 30 years to gain control of American decision-making at the highest levels. The story broke on a Tuesday morning with a headline that sent shockwaves around the world: "Foreign agents infiltrate U.S. government, FBI agents' 40-year investigation exposes massive conspiracy." Within hours, 3 government officials had been arrested. Within days, a dozen more were under federal investigation. Congressional hearings were announced. Special prosecutors were appointed. The American political system was in crisis. But Sarah's role in exposing the conspiracy remained largely secret, at Harold's own insistence. In his final letter to her, he had specifically requested that her identity be protected for as long as possible. "You are not seeking glory or attention," he had written. "You are seeking justice. Let the evidence speak for itself, and let America decide what to do with the truth." The investigation continued for months. Sarah testified before Congress in closed sessions, her identity hidden from the public. She worked with federal prosecutors, helping them understand Harold's evidence and identify additional sources of information. The conspiracy was even more extensive than they had initially realized, involving dozens of officials and millions of dollars in foreign payments. But the cost of her decision was enormous. Sarah could never return to her old life. The safe house became her permanent home, and she lived under constant protection from federal marshals who had been vetted by agencies outside the Justice Department. Her father was moved to a secure facility where his medical needs could be met while keeping him safe from retaliation. 6 months after David Chen's story broke, Harold Winston was posthumously awarded the FBI's highest honor for his service to American national security. But the real recognition came from something else. The American people finally knew the truth about how their government had been compromised, and they were demanding justice. 1 year after Harold's story broke, Sarah Martinez found herself in an unexpected position. The FBI had offered her a special consultant role, working with a newly created task force dedicated to identifying and investigating government corruption. Her unique perspective as someone who had lived outside the system, combined with her intimate knowledge of Harold's methods, made her invaluable to the investigation. But Sarah's new life came with constant reminders of the price she had paid for choosing justice over safety. She lived in a secure apartment in Virginia, her identity protected by federal marshals who accompanied her everywhere. She could never again walk into a diner and simply serve coffee to strangers. That innocent world of Mel's Diner and Tuesday morning regulars felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Her father's care had been arranged through a private medical facility, one of the finest in the country, all expenses covered by a discretionary fund that David Chen had helped establish through his newspaper's foundation. Robert Martinez was comfortable and well cared for, but Sarah could visit him only under security escort, and he still didn't fully understand why his daughter's life had changed so dramatically. The trials had begun 6 months after the story broke. Of the 12 high-ranking officials Harold had identified in his files, 8 had been arrested and charged with various crimes ranging from espionage to money laundering. 2 had fled the country before warrants could be issued. 1 had died in what was officially ruled a suicide but which Sarah suspected was something more sinister. The last had been found murdered in his home, a clear warning to others who might consider cooperating with prosecutors. The conspiracy had been even more extensive than Harold had documented. As federal investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a network of corruption that had spread throughout multiple federal agencies. The foreign influence operation had been active for over 3 decades, carefully placing assets in key positions and gradually compromising American decision-making processes in ways that benefited hostile foreign powers. Sarah's testimony had been crucial in securing convictions. She had spent countless hours in federal courtrooms, explaining Harold's investigation methods and walking juries through the complex web of evidence he had assembled. Her sincerity and obvious courage had made her a compelling witness. And prosecutors credited her testimony with helping to secure several major convictions. But the victories came with a cost that weighed heavily on Sarah's conscience. 3 other whistleblowers who had come forward after Harold's story broke had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. A federal prosecutor working on one of the cases had been killed in a car accident that investigators now believed was deliberate. The network Harold had exposed was fighting back, and people were dying because Sarah had chosen to honor a dying man's final wish. David Chen had won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the conspiracy, but he had also received death threats that forced him to hire private security. His newspaper had been subjected to cyber attacks, legal challenges, and what appeared to be an organized campaign to discredit both the story and everyone involved in reporting it. The truth was winning, but it was coming at an enormous personal cost to everyone who had fought for it. Sarah often found herself thinking about Harold Winston, wondering what he would have thought about how his life's work had unfolded. In quiet moments, she imagined him sitting in booth 7 at Mel's diner, ordering his usual black coffee and wheat toast, watching her with those sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen so much corruption and betrayal. Harold had left behind one final gift that Sarah discovered only after his story had been fully told. Hidden in his apartment, investigators found a sealed envelope with Sarah's name on it, containing a letter he had written just days before his death. In it, he explained that he had never married or had children because his work had made such relationships too dangerous. But he had come to think of Sarah as the daughter he never had, someone who embodied the integrity and courage he had spent his career fighting to protect. "You chose the difficult path," Harold had written, "not because it was easy or profitable, but because it was right. That choice defines who you are, and it honors everyone who has ever fought for truth and justice in this country. Your life will be different now, and sometimes that difference will feel like a burden. But remember that ordinary people doing extraordinary things is how democracy survives. You are living proof that the American dream isn't about wealth or fame, it's about having the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when it costs you everything." The letter included one more surprise. Harold had left Sarah a trust fund worth $2 million, money he had saved throughout his career specifically to help protect whoever continued his work. The fund would provide for her father's care and ensure that Sarah never had to worry about money while she continued fighting corruption from within the system. 5 years after Harold Winston died clutching Sarah's hand in that small diner, the American political landscape looked fundamentally different. The trials had concluded with convictions that sent shockwaves through every level of government. 3 former Supreme Court justices were serving lengthy prison sentences. 4 senators had been stripped of their offices and faced decades behind bars. The foreign influence network that had operated for over 30 years had been dismantled, its assets frozen and its operatives either imprisoned or deported. But the real change wasn't in the courtrooms or the headlines. It was in the new laws that had been passed to prevent such corruption from ever taking root again. The Winston Act, named in Harold's honor, had established the strongest whistleblower protection program in American history. It created independent oversight bodies, mandatory corruption reporting systems, and financial incentives for government employees who exposed wrongdoing. Sarah Martinez had become the face of modern American whistleblowing, though she had never sought that role. She testified before Congress regularly, consulted on new anti-corruption legislation, and worked with federal agencies to identify and investigate suspicious activities. Her life was still constrained by security concerns, but she had found purpose in continuing Harold's mission to protect democratic institutions from those who would corrupt them. The house at 1247 Oak Street had been purchased by the government and transformed into the Harold Winston Center for Government Accountability. The basement where Sarah had discovered the truth now served as a training facility for federal investigators, teaching them Harold's methods for building corruption cases and protecting sources. Sarah visited the center regularly, always stopping at Harold's old desk, which had been preserved exactly as he had left it. Her father had passed away peacefully 2 years earlier, his medical expenses fully covered by Harold's trust fund. In his final months, Robert Martinez had begun to understand what his daughter had sacrificed and why. "You did the right thing, Mija," he had told her near the end. "Your grandmother would have been proud. She always said you had the strongest heart in the family." He had died knowing that his daughter was a hero, even if most of the world would never know her name. David Chen continued to work at the Washington Herald, but his focus had shifted to investigating the international networks that had enabled the conspiracy Harold exposed. His reporting had led to similar corruption scandals being uncovered in 12 other countries, proving that the threat to democratic institutions was global and ongoing. He and Sarah maintained a professional relationship, but both carried the weight of knowing that their pursuit of truth had cost several people their lives. The Winston Foundation, funded by Harold's estate and donations from citizens who believed in government accountability, had grown into one of the most effective anti-corruption organizations in the world. Sarah served as its director, overseeing investigations, supporting other whistleblowers, and advocating for stronger transparency laws. The foundation had helped expose corruption in 43 countries and had protected over 200 whistleblowers from retaliation. On Tuesday mornings, Sarah still sometimes drove past Mel's diner. The restaurant had closed 6 months after Harold's death, unable to recover from the media attention that had descended after the story broke. The building now housed a small grocery store, but Sarah could still see Booth 7 through the window, could still remember Harold sitting there with his black coffee and wheat toast, watching her with those intelligent eyes that had seen so much. The memorial service for Harold Winston was held every year on the anniversary of his death, attended by government officials, journalists, and citizens who understood that democracy required constant vigilance. Sarah always spoke at these services, reminding people that Harold's greatest lesson wasn't about corruption or conspiracy, it was about the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary choices. Harold Winston taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, Sarah would tell the gathered crowd. It's choosing to do what's right even when you're terrified of the consequences. He trusted a waitress with the biggest secret in American political history because he saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. That's what heroes do, they see the potential for goodness in others and they give them a chance to live up to it. The last entry in Harold's journal, which Sarah had read countless times over the years, had become her personal motto: the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and sometimes that vigilance requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things. If you're reading this, then you've chosen to be extraordinary. That choice will define not just your life, but the future of American democracy itself. Sarah Martinez had been a waitress who served coffee to strangers. Now she was a guardian of the truth, carrying on the work of a man who had trusted her with his dying breath. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life that chose her when she honored a simple promise made to a dying customer in booth 7. Sometimes the most important conversations really do happen between strangers. And sometimes, checking a basement at 1247 Oak Street leads to saving democracy itself.